8th Vox Log of Arbites Investigator Alex Salernis, 899, 995, and 41. It took the cell most of the night to descend the requisite 3 or so kilometers necessary to reach the underhive, all of us constantly anxious as we repeatedly glanced out the rear windows looking for pursuers who never materialized. At one point I dozed off on the bench seating next to the catatonic Sienkov, only to be jostled awake as the auto carriage shuddered to a stop in some kind of back alley body shop. Blackwater greased a palm or two with sufficient gill to get all the glass gray-basted shattered replaced, and the myriad slug holes patched within a couple of hours. Around this time, I discovered an electric lowlighter plug in Hilaire's van, for which my recap maker happened to have just the right adapter, who says luxuries are impossible while on the lam. Come early morning, we motored down to the entrance of a massive habstack nominally run by this consortium, a seeming conglomeration of gangs and crime families. Security was thick, and it was clear the Arbites seldom made it down this far, let alone local enforcers. Here, law and order seemed the sole purview of so many criminal enterprises. Blackwater tried gaining access to proceed further in, but his alleged meeting, which he had established through his goons over the past several days, had been rescheduled permanently. Apparently all regular business had been put on hold after the events of last night's gala, which had hit headlines up and down the dome, and the consortium's leadership were busy trying to conceptualize how they might capitalize on this most recent development. Not easily deterred, and now knowing its effectiveness in garnering compliance, the Corsair officer flashed his signet ring at who I could only imagine was the most senior of the gate guards. A lot of voxing on their side happened after that, even as they raised the road barricade and ushered the cell inside. Nearly half a dozen checkpoints awaited us, and as Blackwater navigated through the second, Iosif Sienkov began to stir. Proffering a steaming thermos cap of recaf, I regarded him inquisitively, trying to determine whether or not he was all completely there. As he gulped down the murky brown nectar, Dark confirmed the continued absence of the wizard's psi presence. With that reassurance, I launched into questioning. When asked what he remembered of the previous night, he could recollect only the beginning of the trip to the Grand Prince's estate via motorcade, and seemed unable to remember Interrogator Marn's noble persona, the Baroness von Marius, at all. He was genuinely unaware of any possession or puppeteering on the part of his family psyker, and so I was unable to openly inquire as to his opinion on whether or not his old man had suffered the same interference. His father had been Alexander Sienkov III, who, at the time of his death 4 years ago, had been a, by all accounts, competent and successful statesman, 63 years of age, who would happen to be running for election to an office in the Chamber of Princes. His son did not know the exact office and can only offer up organ failure as his late sire's cause of death. Alexander had apparently rejected rejuvenant treatments against the recommendations of these so-called bureaucrats that seemed so endemic to the household. Unsatisfied with the information which the questioning had produced, I could only mull it over frustratedly as we pulled through the final roadblock. Parking, we were met by a consortium escort immediately upon disembarking. They allowed us to retain our weaponry, but our movements were very clearly to be determined by them. Proceeding into a large, almost warehouse-like space, my senses were assaulted by the combined smells of amasec, low smoke, and aerosolized trank being buffeted by the booming bass of rhythmic synthesizers blaring out of speaker stacks piled 10 meters high. Dimly lit by strobing illuminator strips embedded in the floor tiles were hundreds of writhing bodies swaying and dancing in time to the pounding cacophony. If I had to describe the combined effect of the place in one word, it would be disorienting. We were then led down a short hallway in the back, which admitted us into another large chamber dominated by a hololithic depiction of Ramar, some 5 to 10 meters across. Dozens more consortium goons were in here, manning rows of cogitator-equipped workstations, though these fellows were more professionally dressed than most of the partygoers I had seen on the way in. In the center of the room, in front of the suspended flickering globe, was a broad grate flanked by a pair of bruiser-ab humans. Cajoled into standing atop the slatted metal panels, a faint splashing could be heard below, barely perceptible against the music reverberating through the entire structure. On the far side of the globe, along the southern wall, was a raised stage with 5 ornate chairs arrayed abreast, though the third sat slightly forward of the others in its central position. Already occupying the second from the right was a younger woman busying herself with a small silver cylinder, her legs lazily tossed over one of the upholstered arms. Eventually catching her attention, she introduced herself as Lucia Sinelikova, leader of the consortium. I could tell without a second glance that she wasn't. No one is in these kinds of composite organizations, at least in my experience. She promptly went back to ignoring us as a hollow projector haltingly lowered from the ceiling before rendering the choppy likeness of some kind of pilot or racer. This second consortium boss trode up and down the stage, his mouth moving as if speaking for several minutes before realizing his Vox capture had yet to be enabled. Once on, he reintroduced himself as Voidborn Vorkolk before sitting down in the center seat. Next, a shirtless and heavily tattooed man kicked open a door on the left side of the elevated platform, swaggering onto stage, swinging a gruesome-looking serrated monosword lazily about before leaping over the back of the left chair and squatting there. He glared at all of us and began barking taunts with a grotesque forked tongue until Vorkolk reined him in. If his goal was looking like something feral, he achieved it. Last to arrive was another holographic projection, this one of a heavily augmented man who would remain nameless initially. He remotely occupied the far right seat as the audience began. Blackwater did most of the talking and opted for a straightforward approach, explaining the likely instability that would follow the Grand Prince's grab for power should his plans be allowed to bear fruit, and the highly probable loss in profits amidst the socio-political turbulence afterwards. In exchange for aiding Arcel and getting to the royal family, he went on to argue the consortium could stand to gain significant influence in the vacuums left behind, Frolov and his cronies, upon their liquidation. Jeering at us again, the swordsman was checked a second time by Vorkolk, who excused himself and his fellow crime bosses for deliberation in some chamber behind the stage. For our part, we were escorted back to a cramped and curtained booth set into the wall of the main dance area. When Garn attempted to leave for drinks, he was politely told by the Ogrins standing guard in no uncertain terms that our leaving the space was prohibited. Powder residue and disconcertingly luminescent fluids were covering parts of the table, which I made certain to disperse with the sleeve of my coat before Alair could slam his augmetic drinking tube into any of it. The Lux Imperialis is absolute on the matter. Mind-altering substance abuse destroys individuals, families, and societies. At around this time, Sienkov burst out angrily, the facade of our returning him to his manor now completely forgotten, seeing as he had just heard our entire exchange with the most powerful syndicate chiefs of the Underhive. I almost enjoyed tearing into him, explaining his true situation, the possession, the gala, the coup, and watching the weight of reality finally crack his veneer of disassociated apathy. To the young noble's credit, however, he quieted up as he began to mull over everything he'd just learned for the first time in his sheltered life. Our pal Yosef just might be capable of thinking for himself, after all. Sienkov had perked up at the mention of the late Colonel Pavlovich, going on to say he believed the man had been present at his father's funeral. The significance of this relation is presently beyond me. Half an hour or so later, we were fetched by consortium goons and led back to their operations stage to find 4 of the 5 seats occupied by the crime bosses again, ready to render the results of their deliberation. As the Voidborn stood flickering in monochrome, a slew of alerts and notifications began chiming across multiple cogitators, their operators quickly acting to suppress the din. Long-range augers, the possession of which proving the organization's substantial affluence, had detected the warp translation of the Cobra-class destroyer Bountiful Gelt, formerly the Wrath of Phobos, into real space nearby, a little under 1 day out. This was a privately owned vessel in the service of Blackwater's patron, the rogue trader Marius Moon, and the last time I'd encountered it had been in low planetary orbit above Firestorm just a year or 2 ago. Capitalizing on its sudden arrival as a means to boost our credibility, Hilaire pressed Vorkolk one final time for his group's assistance. It paid off, and the hollow globe in between us disappeared in a burst of distortion that recoalesced as a three-dimensional floor plan of the royal palace suspended beneath the apex of the hive dome. Apparently, the absent fifth member of the consortium's leadership had died recovering this information personally, thus explaining the empty third seat. Describing the existence of sewage ducts that could allow us inside the palace was the criminal cogboy on the right, now speaking for the first time. I asked him his name, and he returned with Theta 4. Granted the floor plan and the access route via the infrastructure pipes beneath the palace, we were able to depart. Interrogator Marn was less than enthusiastic about cooperating with such a shady collective, but Enos was able to secure us communication with Spear 6 after several hours on the portable cogitator in the back of Blackwater's autocarriage. Spear 6 was flabbergasted when we told him of the impending coup, but agreed to try his damnedest in the creation of a distraction within the royal palace, intended to coincide with our own insertion. For the rest of the day, I did my best to skim the various public pick channels and Vox stations in order to gauge the city's reaction to the events of the night prior. And surprisingly, the Grand Prince had released a public statement condemning us as off-world terrorists hell-bent on dismantling the local aristocracy. While our descriptions failed to make it onto any of the Arbites or Enforcer Vox scanners, everyone in the cell agreed that pics of our likenesses from Frolov's estate cameras are most certainly being distributed throughout the upper hive at this point. After a fitful and uncomfortable sleep, partially remedied by recaf and low sticks, we began making our way towards access juncture Epsilon 382 down in the twisted bowels of Primus's drainage system. On the way, we rendezvoused with nearly 100 of Trader Moon's dynastic guards, a band of gruff paramilitary voidsmen under the command of a first mate, Bertain Stain IV. Blackwater had requested them as reinforcements, and while they're not the most lavishly equipped shooters this side of the Kiplov March, I suspect they'll distinguish themselves admirably in the coming strike. Hire also seems to have come into the possession of a power sword, supposedly bought off of one of the rogue traders' mercs. At least now he'll stop talking about it. There's still a lot of questions swirling in my head. Untraced contacts, leads, half forgotten, motives and ramifications missing or glossed over. But all of that falls away with the sense of purpose a committed raid instills. I'm eager to bring the weight of imperial law down atop these seditious rats, and that all starts with safely extracting King Stepanov and his family. And Vox Log.